The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly in every direction, its surface painted black under the pre-dawn sky. Gentle swells roll against the steel hulls of Japanese warships, creating a rhythmic lapping that has lulled many sailors into the false comfort of routine. On the bridge of the heavy cruiser Haguro, Commander Takeshi Yamamoto cradles a cup of green tea, its steam rising in delicate spirals that vanish into the cool morning air. The warmth against his palms feels reassuring, a small ritual of normalcy in a war that has, so far, gone exactly according to plan. Below decks, petty officers move through their morning inspections with practiced efficiency. The smell of miso soup drifts from the galley, mixing with the ever-present tang of salt air and machine oil. Everything is as it should be. Everything is under control. The Empire's perimeter stretches thousands of miles in every direction, an iron ring of conquered islands and naval bases that no enemy could possibly penetrate undetected. But something is different this morning, though none of them know it yet. The darkness seems deeper somehow, more expectant. The silence between the waves carries an weight that presses against the eardrums of lookouts scanning empty horizons through their binoculars. One young seaman, barely 18, pauses in his watch and tilts his head. For just a moment he thought he heard something, a distant rumble, like thunder from a storm still hours away. The sky begins its slow transformation from black to deep purple, and with it comes a sound that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It starts as little more than a whisper, a barely perceptible drone that could be mistaken for the ship's own engines. But it grows, and grows, until the drone becomes a hum, the hum becomes a roar, and the roar becomes the unmistakable thunder of aircraft engines, dozens of them, in a punto, roaching fast and low across the water. Commander Yamamoto drops his teacup. The porcelain shatters against the steel deck with a sharp crack that seems impossibly loud in the sudden stillness, because in that moment, every man on every ship knows that their world is about to change forever. The Empire's illusion of invincibility is about to be shattered as surely as that teacup, scattered in pieces across an unforgiving sea. The sun hasn't even risen yet, but already the day of reckoning has begun. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, we must step back 6 months earlier, when the Japanese Empire stood at the absolute pinnacle of its power. From the frozen airfields of the Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Java, the rising sun flag flew over an oceanic domain larger than any empire in human history. In Tokyo's marble-clad war rooms, admirals moved wooden ships across charts that seemed to confirm what propaganda broadcasts proclaimed daily. Japan was invincible. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, not to be confused with our cruiser commander, stood before a massive map of the Pacific, its blue expanse now dotted with red pins marking conquered territories. Each pin represented thousands of lives, entire nations brought under the Empire's control in a matter of months. Wake Island, fallen after a heroic but futile defense. Guam, surrendered after a brief bombardment. Hong Kong, captured on Christmas Day. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, had collapsed like a house of cards. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil reserves, had been swept up in what Japanese newspapers called 100 victorious days. Personal letters home from Japanese officers during this period reveal an almost intoxicating confidence. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakajima wrote to his wife in Osaka, "The Americans fight like confused children. Their ships flee at the first sight of our aircraft. I begin to wonder if this war will last long enough for me to earn proper glory." Another officer serving aboard the battleship Yamato confided to his diary, "We have built a wall of steel around our homeland. No enemy fleet could approach within 1,000 miles without our knowing." This wasn't mere boastfulness. It was the logical conclusion drawn from an unbroken string of victories. American forces had been driven from the Philippines in humiliating retreat. The British Pacific Fleet had been effectively neutered, Australia itself seemed within reach, its northern cities already feeling the sting of Japanese air raids. In the conquered territories, Japanese administrators set up schools where children learned to bow toward Tokyo each morning, their young voices reciting pledges of loyalty to an emperor they would never see. The perimeter seemed unbreachable, a vast network of fortified islands, patrolling submarines, and reconnaissance aircraft that should have made any surprise attack impossible. Japanese intelligence officers pored over shipping reports and radio intercepts, confident in their ability to track every enemy movement across thousands of miles of ocean. How could they know that American codebreakers were already reading their most secret communications? How could they imagine that enemy carriers were closing in, hidden beneath radio silence and careful deception? The empire had reached its high tide, but tides, by their very nature, must eventually turn. While Japanese admirals studied maps of their expanded empire, a very different kind of planning was taking place in the cramped quarters of Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The acrid smell of cigarette smoke mixed with coffee that had been brewing too long hung in the air as intelligence analysts worked through the night, their faces illuminated by the green glow of plotting boards and code machines. They were piecing together something that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, a way to strike back at the heart of Japanese naval power. The key lay not in superior numbers or bigger guns, but in something far more subtle: information. Deep in the basement of Station HYPO, Navy cryptographers had achieved what many thought impossible. They were reading Japanese naval codes with increasing accuracy. Each intercepted message revealed patterns, movements, vulnerabilities. Commander Joseph Rochefort, his uniform rumpled from days without proper sleep, studied the decoded intercepts with the intensity of a chess master seeing several moves ahead. The Japanese were predictable in their confidence, following communication protocols that revealed their positions and intentions to anyone clever enough to listen. But intelligence was only half the equation. The real weapon would be speed, stealth, and the revolutionary concept of the aircraft carrier as the Navy's primary striking force. Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, moved through the Pacific darkness like ghosts made of steel. Admiral William Bull Halsey, commanding from the Enterprise, understood that his ships represented a new kind of warfare, one where the enemy could be struck from beyond the horizon, without warning, without the traditional courtesies of naval engagement. The carriers themselves were marvels of engineering and human coordination on the hangar decks of the Enterprise. Mechanics worked by the dim glow of red lights, tuning engines and loading ordnance with a precision that bordered on artistry. Each aircraft was a carefully balanced instrument of war: dive bombers loaded with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, torpedo planes carrying the deadly fish that could crack a battleship's hull, fighters ready to clear the skies of opposition. The pilots, many of them barely older than the Japanese lookouts they would soon surprise, played cards and wrote letters home, their nervous energy contained beneath a veneer of casual confidence. Navigation across the trackless Pacific required skills that seemed almost supernatural. Without GPS or satellites, these ships relied on celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and an intimate understanding of wind and current. Chief Navigator Thomas Maloney aboard the Hornet spent hours bent over his charts, calculating courses that would bring his task force within striking distance while avoiding Japanese patrol lines. 1 degree of error, one miscalculation, and the entire mission could end in disaster. Radio silence was absolute. No messages home, no routine communications, no electronic signatures that might reveal their presence. The carriers moved through the darkness, trailing only phosphorescent wakes that dissolved within minutes, leaving no trace of their passage. They were hunters in the most dangerous sense, approaching prey that vastly outnumbered them, betting everything on the element of surprise and the skill of young men who had never been tested in real combat. Dawn was still hours away, but the dice were already rolling. The first hint of catastrophe came not from radar screens or radio intercepts, but from the sharp eyes of Seaman First Class Kenji Watanabe, standing watch aboard the destroyer Arashi. At 0547 hours, as the eastern sky began its slow transition from black to deep purple, Watanabe caught something that made him pause, a glint of metal, there and gone again, almost lost in the morning haze. He raised his binoculars with hands that were suddenly unsteady, scanning the horizon with the methodical precision drilled into him during months of convoy duty. There, again. Small, dark shapes moving against the lighter sky, still distant but unmistakably approaching. For a moment his mind refused to process what his eyes were telling him. Japanese aircraft didn't operate in this area at this hour. But these weren't Japanese aircraft. The alarm klaxon aboard the Arashi shattered the morning quiet with a harsh mechanical shriek that seemed to tear the air itself. Within seconds, similar alarms began sounding across the scattered formation of Japanese ships, cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliaries that had been conducting what they assumed was a routine patrol in completely secure waters. On bridges throughout the formation, officers grabbed binoculars and telephone handsets, their voices sharp with the controlled panic of professionals suddenly facing the impossible. Commander Yamamoto, still on the bridge of the Haguro, felt his stomach lurch as the implications hit him like a physical blow. American aircraft here meant American carriers somewhere over the horizon. But intelligence had assured them that no enemy task force could possibly be within 500 miles of their position. The nearest American base was thousands of miles away. How could they have gotten so close without being detected? The scramble that followed had all the desperate energy of men awakening from a nightmare to find it was real. Fighter aircraft on nearby airfields received frantic radio calls to launch immediately, but precious minutes were lost in confusion and disbelief. Anti-aircraft crews stumbled to their guns, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The beautiful morning that had begun with tea and routine inspections had transformed into something from their worst nightmares. An enemy attack with no warning, no time to prepare, no chance to call for help. Aboard the American strike aircraft, now clearly visible as they approached their targets, pilots felt their own surge of adrenaline mixed with grim satisfaction. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading a squadron of dive bombers from the Enterprise, spoke into his radio with the calm professionalism that would define this new generation of naval aviators. Target in sight. All units, commence your attack runs. Make every shot count. The sun was rising behind the American aircraft, casting long shadows across the water and turning their wings into silhouettes against the brightening sky. To the Japanese sailors below, it must have seemed like some apocalyptic vision, death itself approaching with the dawn, their own sun rising behind the instruments of their destruction. In less than 10 minutes, the myth of Japanese naval invincibility would be shattered forever. But first, there would be fire. The first bomb fell at 0612 hours, and with it, the carefully ordered universe of the Japanese Pacific Fleet exploded into chaos and flame. Lieutenant Jimmy Doolittle Jr., no relation to the famous raider, rolled his SBD Dauntless into a near-vertical dive, the wind screaming past his cockpit as the deck of the heavy cruiser Haguro grew larger in his bomb sight. At 2,000 feet, he pulled the release lever and felt his aircraft lurch upward as the 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb dropped away, its path as inevitable as gravity itself. Commander Yamamoto, still on the bridge of the Haguro, had perhaps 3 seconds to understand what was happening before the bomb struck his ship just aft of the forward turret. The explosion lifted the bow section 6 feet out of the water, buckling steel plates like cardboard and sending a pillar of black smoke and orange flame climbing toward the morning sky. The concussion knocked Yamamoto to his knees, his eardrums shattered by the thunderclap of high-explosive meeting armor plate. But the cruiser was only the beginning. Across the scattered formation, torpedo bombers from the Hornet were making their own deadly approaches, skimming just above the wave tops at speeds that seemed to defy physics. Ensign George Gay, piloting a TBD Devastator loaded with a Mark 13 torpedo, aimed for the stern of the destroyer Arashi, the same ship whose lookout had first spotted the incoming strike. His torpedo hit just below the waterline, the explosion opening a gash 30 feet long and flooding the engine room in less than 2 minutes. The sound was indescribable, not one explosion but dozens, overlapping and reinforcing each other until individual detonations were lost in a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very ocean. Aboard the auxiliary vessel Kyokuto Maru, Petty Officer Masahiro Ito pressed his hands against his ears and watched in horrified fascination as geysers of water and debris erupted around every ship in the formation. A dive bomber pulled up from its attack run not 50 yards from his position, close enough that he could see the pilot's face beneath his helmet, young, determined, focused entirely on the destruction he had just delivered. The Japanese anti-aircraft response, when it finally came, was desperate but largely ineffective. Gunners who had trained for months in perfect conditions found themselves trying to track targets moving at 300 miles per hour, while their own ships rolled and shuddered under bomb impacts. Tracer rounds drew bright arcs against the morning sky, but most fell short or wide. The Americans had achieved something that military theorists had only dreamed of: complete tactical surprise executed with devastating precision. On the bridge of the light cruiser Yubari, Captain Kashima Kichi grabbed a speaking tube and shouted orders that were almost immediately rendered meaningless by another direct hit that knocked out his primary communications. Through the smoke and flame, he caught glimpses of other ships in similar distress. The destroyer Yugiri listing heavily to port, her crew abandoning ship, the cruiser Haguro burning from stem to stern, but still firing her main guns at targets that were already disappearing over the horizon. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes from first bomb to last strafing run, but for the men caught in its fury, it seemed to stretch into hours. Seaman Watanabe, the young lookout who had first spotted the approaching aircraft, found himself clinging to a piece of wreckage as his destroyer settled beneath the waves. The water was black with oil and red with blood from men who had been laughing and drinking morning tea just minutes before. Around him, the Pacific burned with the funeral pyres of Japanese naval confidence. As the American aircraft disappeared into the rising sun, they left behind a scene that would haunt the survivors forever. Proud ships broken and burning, the ocean littered with debris and desperate men, and the terrible knowledge that the war they thought they were winning had just taken a very different turn. 300 miles away, in the secure communications center of the Combined Fleet headquarters at Truk Lagoon, Admiral Chuchi Nagumo was reviewing morning intelligence reports when the first fragmentary radio transmissions began arriving. The messages came in broken bursts, distorted by static and the obvious distress of their senders. Under heavy air attack, multiple ships hit. Request immediate assistance. At first, Nagumo assumed he was hearing reports of a training exercise gone wrong, or perhaps an exaggerated account of a minor skirmish with American reconnaissance aircraft. But as more reports flooded in, each more desperate than the last, the terrible truth began to crystallize. This wasn't a small probe or a diversionary raid. This was a major carrier strike, executed with a precision and boldness that challenged every assumption about American naval capabilities. Nagumo found himself staring at the plotting board in his command center, trying to make sense of intelligence that seemed to contradict the laws of physics. How could American carriers have penetrated so deeply into Japanese-controlled waters without being detected? Captain Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer and one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, bent over the radio transcripts with growing alarm. The attack patterns described by surviving ships matched perfectly with American carrier doctrine. Coordinated strikes by dive bombers and torpedo planes, executed with the kind of timing that spoke of extensive training and careful planning. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the chatter of radio operators. "This suggests they have been planning this operation for months, perhaps since Pearl Harbor itself." The implications were staggering. If American carriers could strike this far forward, then the entire defensive perimeter that Japan had so setoured artfully constructed, was essentially meaningless. Every island base, every convoy route, every anchorage was potentially vulnerable to surprise attack. Worse still, the success of this raid would inevitably encourage more American aggression. Enemy planners would see that the supposedly invincible Japanese fleet could be hit and hurt, their ships sunk, their carefully laid plans disrupted by bold action and superior intelligence. In Tokyo, the news reached Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada as he was preparing for a routine meeting with Emperor Hirohito. The decoded message from Truk arrived on his desk at 07:30, and Shimada read it 3 times before the full impact hit him. He had been planning to brief the Emperor on Japan's continuing naval dominance, to discuss expansion of operations in the Indian Ocean. Instead, he now faced the humiliating task of explaining how American aircraft had penetrated the Empire's defenses to strike at will against Japanese forces. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through months of victories, had suffered its first serious crack. And cracks, as any naval architect knows, have a tendency to spread under pressure until the entire structure fails catastrophically. The tide of war in the Pacific had just begun its slow but inexorable turn. The strategic implications of that dawn raid rippled outward like shockwaves from an underwater explosion, reaching far beyond the immediate damage inflicted on Japanese ships and personnel. In Washington, D.C., the first reports reached Navy Secretary Frank Knox's desk at 1400 hours, late afternoon on the East Coast, but only hours after the attack itself. Knox read the preliminary damage assessments twice, then reached for his secure telephone to call President Roosevelt directly. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American naval forces had struck a significant blow against Japanese naval power in their own waters. The psychological impact was even more important than the tactical success. Across the Pacific Fleet, news of the raid spread with the speed of radio waves and the enthusiasm of men who had been waiting months for revenge. Aboard the submarine USS Wahoo, patrolling off the Japanese coast, Executive Officer Richard O'Kane recorded in his log, "Morale has never been higher. The Japs aren't 10 feet tall after all. If our carriers can hit them this hard, this far from home, then maybe this war isn't going to last as long as everyone thought." But perhaps the most significant impact was on American strategic planning itself. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, convened an emergency meeting of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to discuss the implications of carrier aviation's demonstrated effectiveness. The successful raid proved that fast carrier task forces could penetrate enemy defenses, deliver devastating attacks, and withdraw before effective countermeasures could be organized. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was validation of an entirely new way of fighting naval warfare. For the Japanese, the consequences were equally profound but infinitely more troubling. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, spent the evening after the Shont attack walking the decks of his flagship Yamato, contemplating intelligence reports that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. American carrier doctrine was evolving rapidly, becoming more aggressive and more effective. If this trend continued, Japan's carefully planned defensive strategy would need fundamental revision. The attack also exposed critical weaknesses in Japanese intelligence and early warning systems. How had an entire task force approached within striking distance without being detected? Post-action analysis revealed disturbing gaps in reconnaissance coverage, communication failures between different commands, and a dangerous overconfidence that had led to relaxed security procedures. These were systemic problems that couldn't be fixed overnight, and Japanese planners knew that American forces would undoubtedly attempt to exploit them again. Most ominously, the raid demonstrated that American industrial capacity was beginning to show results. The aircraft that had struck so effectively were products of factories that had been retooling for war production since 1940. If American shipyards and aircraft plants could maintain their current pace of production, the numerical balance that had favored Japan so heavily in early 1942 would inevitably shift toward the United States. The dawn raid had been more than just a successful attack. It was a glimpse of the future, and that future looked very different from Japan's original war plans. As the sun set over the Pacific that evening, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to echo the fires that had burned on Japanese ships that morning, both sides found themselves contemplating a war that had fundamentally changed in the space of 20 minutes. The wreckage still floated on the gentle swells, pieces of deck plating, empty life preservers, oil slicks that caught the last light like dark mirrors reflecting a transformed world. Aboard the carrier Enterprise, now safely beyond the reach of Japanese retaliation, pilots and aircrew gathered in the ready rooms to debrief their missions. The conversations were subdued despite their success. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, who had led the dive bomber attack, sat quietly in a corner, writing a letter to his wife that he would never send. The words kept coming out wrong, unable to capture the complexity of emotions that came with delivering death from the sky. These young men had proven themselves in combat, but the proof had come at a cost that would only become clear in the weeks and months ahead. In Tokyo, the evening brought emergency meetings in rooms where maps were hurriedly redrawn and defensive plans underwent radical revision. The comfortable assumptions that had guided Japanese strategy for the first months of the war were being questioned, challenged, and in some cases abandoned entirely. Admiral Shimada, facing Emperor Hirohito's quiet but penetrating questions about naval security, found himself using words like unprecedented and unforeseeable to describe what was ultimately a failure of imagination. The human cost was measured not just in ships sunk and lives lost, but in confidence shattered and certainties dissolved. Petty Officer Ito, pulled from the water by a Japanese rescue vessel, would spend the rest of his life startling awake at the sound of aircraft engines. Seaman Watana, the young lookout whose sharp eyes had provided the first warning, survived but would carry survivor's guilt for decades. They had witnessed the end of one era of naval warfare and the violent birth of another. But perhaps the most profound change was in the nature of the Pacific War itself. The attack had demonstrated that distance was no longer a reliable defense, that technological superiority could overcome numerical disadvantage, and that the initiative in warfare could shift with devastating speed. Both sides now understood that this would be a different kind of conflict, faster, more violent, more dependent on intelligence and innovation than any naval war in history. As night fell over the Pacific, the ocean itself seemed different somehow, no longer a vast protective barrier, but a highway that could carry death in any direction. The age of the aircraft carrier had truly begun, and with it a new chapter in the long story of nations that rise and fall with the turning of the tides. The sun had set on Japanese naval supremacy, though few yet realized that this particular day would be remembered as the moment when the tide of war in the Pacific began its slow but inexorable turn toward a very different kind of victory.